Let's begin by removing the velvet curtains of fantasy and peeking into the drafty corners of medieval bedrooms. No, there were no rose petals on straw mattresses or scented oils by flickering candlelight. Most homes were single-room wooden boxes shared by everyone: parents, children, livestock, and dust. If you were lucky, the family chicken wouldn't roost on your feet while you tried to whisper sweet nothings. In the medieval world, privacy wasn't a right, it was a luxury beyond reach for the average peasant. A moment of intimacy required creativity, stealth, and sometimes bribing the goat with stale bread. Because when the stable is your bedroom and your in-laws your roommates, subtlety becomes a survival skill. The medieval home was a 3-in-1: kitchen, bedroom, and animal shelter, separated only by the smell of turnips. Beds were scarce, and where they did exist, they were shared, often by an entire family or visiting relatives. A husband and wife seeking alone time had to navigate snoring children, wheezing grandparents, and barking dogs. If the baby wasn't crying, the cow probably was, and if both were asleep, the rooster might decide to join the party. Some families hung up cloth partitions, make-do curtains for imaginary privacy, which fooled no one. Those too poor for fabric simply waited for darkness, fatigue, or divine intervention to offer a window of opportunity. Love in the Middle Ages, especially among peasants, was less candlelit and more candles stolen from the chapel. Upper-class bedrooms weren't much better, only more crowded with witnesses in silk. Servants often slept at the foot of the bed, pretending to be asleep while hearing everything they wished they hadn't. In noble households, intimacy was a supervised activity, with legal documents detailing who slept where and when. Some lords kept records of bedroom schedules for religious reasons, others for inheritance, and some just because. Courtly romance often took place in the presence of a third party, like a bored page or suspicious priest. A noblewoman couldn't sneak a kiss without a cousin knitting in the corner or a servant holding a candlestick. In these environments, passion had to squeeze itself between etiquette and upholstery. Travel didn't help matters. It made them stranger. Inns had shared beds, shared rooms, and zero sense of personal boundaries. You might fall asleep beside your spouse and wake up next to a farmer, a merchant, and their boots. Want to cuddle? First, make sure the stranger beside you isn't armed or snoring directly into your neck. Privacy on the road was a roll of the dice, and intimacy required either trust or complete indifference. Many travelers developed a sense of humor or a deep acceptance of fate, especially when the bedding smelled of soup. Romance, in this case, meant not rolling off the straw mattress onto someone else's baggage. The church, ever eager to supervise human behavior, had plenty to say about what happened behind closed curtains, except those curtains rarely closed, and the advice was rarely welcome. According to medieval Christian doctrine, intimacy had one and only one sacred purpose: procreation. Pleasure, suspicious; bonding, distracting; stress relief, unacceptable. Bishops wrote entire volumes dictating the correct timing, positions, and spiritual intentions of marital acts. Every holy day, fast day, saint's day, and moon phase came with restrictions, delays, or outright bans. You didn't need permission to marry, but you practically needed a permit to enjoy it. Church rules weren't merely guidelines, they were more like divine obstacle courses wrapped in Latin. No intimacy on Sundays, the Lord's Day, Fridays, penance, or Wednesdays, because why not? Lent? Forget it. Advent? Not a chance. Feasts, vigils, eclipses, better go read a psalm instead. In some regions, the calendar allowed only a few safe days each month for conjugal bonding. A 13th century bishop once scolded a married couple for showing excessive affection twice in 1 month. He recommended they channel their passion into prayer, preferably clothed and 3 feet apart. Naturally, the couple was reportedly not impressed. Even within marriage, there were expectations, and not particularly joyful ones. One guide encouraged couples to engage in intimacy without pleasure, without delay, and without sin. That's not a romance novel. It's more like a slow-moving tax form. The only approved position was missionary, believed to be most natural and least offensive to heaven. Any deviation from position to enthusiasm was labeled suspicious or heretical. To be too eager with your spouse, that could lead to pointed questions in confession, and those confessions were shockingly specific. Medieval priests knew more than they probably wanted to. Peasant communities, meanwhile, smiled, nodded, and quietly ignored half the rules. Their lives were dictated more by seasons than by sermons, more by frost than by feast days. If your child had just stopped coughing, your pigs hadn't escaped, and it wasn't raining inside, then yes, maybe affection was possible. No one wanted to ask a priest if the stars aligned, or if St. Boniface's feast overlapped with a new moon. They just wanted 15 minutes without interruption, judgment, or someone stepping on a rake. Intimacy wasn't spiritual, it was survival. A rare moment to feel human between the endless cycles of labor and prayer. And sometimes, that was sacred enough. Of course, discretion was key. Gossip in villages flowed faster than wine at harvest. Neighbors became moral detectives, piecing together clues from laundry timing and suspicious foot traffic. If a young woman emerged from the wrong door at sunrise, it wasn't just noticed, it was narrated, embroidered, and performed. Old women at the well became village oracles, decoding glances and predicting scandal. Reputations could rise or fall over a misinterpreted cough or an unattended goat. Privacy wasn't just rare, it was impossible. Even thoughts felt like they needed permission slips, so every moment of stolen intimacy was both an act of love and an act of courage. The threat of shame loomed over every flirtation, every shared glance across the rye fields. A couple might steal a kiss in the barn, only to find themselves the subject of a Sunday sermon. "Some among you," the priest would thunder, "have been too spirited near the barley." No names were mentioned, of course, but everyone turned to look at poor Agnes and thatched roof Thomas. Still, people didn't stop. They simply got smarter, scheduling their affection between milking hours and thunderstorms. If that meant courting behind hay bales while pretending to check on a squeaky chicken, so be it. Passion bent to fit the cracks in the day. Sometimes, those little acts of rebellion had consequences. Fines were levied for inappropriate conduct, a term broad enough to include winking too confidently. A couple caught too close under a tree could face a church trial, or worse, a public apology in front of neighbors. Nothing says romance like being forced to say, "I'm sorry for hand-holding," while holding a candle and sweating. The punishment varied depending on your social rank, marital status, and how juicy the scandal was. In some towns, violators were paraded in shifts, long linen garments of shame, through the village square. In others, they had to buy a new church bench as penance, complete with their names carved in gilt. Despite the risks, many couples continued with secret courtships. Some relied on coded songs, sung under windows by night, hinting at feelings while pretending it was about sheep. A girl might drop her embroidery thread near a young man's boots, and the village would suddenly become aware of impending marriage. Even a glance at the midsummer festival could lead to days of speculation and a rushed dowry negotiation. In noble courts, love was equally stifled, though more poetic. A knight might pledge undying love to a lady married to his liege lord, then write 600 lines of badly rhymed longing, because nothing says forbidden romance like Latin verses delivered by a page with acne. For the lucky few, love led to marriage, though even that wasn't simple. Marriage in medieval Europe was a legal contract first, an emotional adventure second. You didn't need a priest, just a verbal agreement. Yes, two people alone in a field saying, "I will," technically counted. This created problems when people forgot to mention they were already married. Bigamy cases weren't rare, just awkward and often solved by someone going on a long pilgrimage. Once married, couples had to navigate family expectations, church demands, and a community ready to weigh in on everything. From bedroom habits to childbirth spacing, everyone had an opinion, and none of it was gentle. The church insisted on regulation even after marriage. Too much pleasure, sin, too little, suspicion, wrong position, heresy. It wasn't enough to be wed. You had to be properly wed, regularly confessed, and occasionally shamed. Priests asked pointed questions, looking for signs of lust disguised as affection. "Did you smile during the act?" one confessor might ask, quill poised like a moral dagger. A farmer would stammer, "Maybe." It was dark. There was a breeze. And so penance began, not for what was done, but for what might have been enjoyed. If you were hoping medieval Europe made room for passion, think again. The church had other plans. Intimacy wasn't spontaneous. It was scheduled, regulated, and supervised from above. Want to be with your spouse? You'd need a calendar, a saint's feast day list, and maybe a bishop's blessing. Wednesdays, suspicious. Fridays, day of penance. Sundays, the Lord's Day, absolutely not. Add Lent, Advent, and a rotating cast of martyrs' anniversaries, and suddenly the year looked very chaste. Some confession manuals outlawed nearly half the calendar year for marital closeness, which made affection feel less like romance and more like dodging spiritual landmines. It wasn't just about when, it was about how and how much. The church didn't oppose sex outright, but it liked to remind you that joy was a dangerous indulgence. Pleasure was allowed only as a byproduct of procreation, and even then, moderation was expected. One medieval guide advised couples to proceed without lust, without delay, and without smiles. In other words, don't enjoy it, don't linger, and certainly don't do it with enthusiasm. The approved position was missionary, deemed natural, and less likely to anger the angels. Anything else was considered risky for the soul, and maybe the back. In confession, priests didn't just ask, "Have you sinned?" They asked how, when, and in what position. The level of detail would put modern questionnaires to shame. Did you have impure thoughts? Did you take initiative? Did you do anything different? The goal wasn't just repentance, it was control. Even married couples had to confess if they'd felt too much affection. Lust, even inside marriage, was viewed with deep suspicion, and a particularly passionate spouse might find themselves praying for forgiveness and cold water. Some priests genuinely believed they were protecting souls. Others seemed a bit too invested in the details. One friar was known for asking whether couples had smiled during intimacy, because joy, evidently, was heretical. Another insisted that any attempt at seduction within marriage was akin to spiritual rebellion. For many lay people, these rules felt less like guidance and more like surveillance. Still, most responded with polite nods, crossed fingers, and a very different approach at home. Medieval hypocrisy? Alive, well, and often well-dressed. The church's reach was deep, but enforcement varied wildly by region, class, and the mood of your local clergy. Some priests turned a blind eye to minor transgressions, especially if you brought a goose or some cheese. Others were zealous moral enforcers who read bedroom sins from the pulpit, but even the strictest preacher couldn't follow everyone home. So, behind closed shutters and beneath creaky roofs, life continued as it always had, awkward and affectionate. People might sin in the evening and confess in the morning, then do it all again by Thursday. Faith and desire walked hand in hand, occasionally stepping on each other's toes. Among the upper classes, restrictions could be even more intense. Noble households often employed spiritual advisors who doubled as guilt machines. A lady might be monitored not just by her maid, but by a chaplain armed with parchment and pen. Every touch, smile, or visit could be scrutinized, recorded, and discussed behind chapel doors. In such settings, affection had to be subtle, folded into poetry, hidden in embroidery, or slipped into music.
To fall in love while titled was a gamble with politics, inheritance, and eternal damnation. And if you lost loudly. Peasants, by contrast, maintained a more relaxed rhythm. They followed the church's teachings in theory, but in practice, survival came first. If it was a warm night and the pigs weren't screaming, that counted as a green light. Few had the time or education to memorize lists of forbidden days and proper positions. They listened to the sermons, sure, but they also listened to the rhythms of the farm and the heart. A good harvest brought blessings. A new child, even unplanned, was rarely cursed. The saints might have disapproved, but the chickens didn't. Still, even peasants had to navigate village scrutiny. Moral watchdogs weren't just priests. They were neighbors, midwives, and chatty grandmothers. A baby born 9 months after the May festival sparked rumors. A man who visited his sweetheart's hut too often might be offered marriage broth by her mother. One too many moonlit visits, and you'd find yourself summoned before the village court. There, local elders decided if you owed penance or wedding bells. Justice moved fast when gossip set the pace. To track all this behavior, some towns kept moral rolls, ledgers of community sins. These weren't private documents. They were public reminders of everyone's mistakes. Marjorie, for consorting with the baker behind the granary. Thomas, for fondling by the duck pond during Advent. The offences ranged from serious to silly, but once inked, they stuck.
Fines were paid, apologies were made, and reputations reshuffled. But nothing spread faster than shame tied to a name. If you were lucky, a quick marriage could erase your fine. It was called retroactive permission, turning a scandal into a sacrament. If the couple got married soon after the offence, the punishment might be reduced or cancelled. Families, eager to restore honour, pushed for swift vows, sometimes within days. This led to many awkward wedding nights spent with regret and leftover wine. But for the couple, it beat standing in front of the whole village reading out loud their sin like a bedtime story. Even love under pressure was better than public humiliation. This delicate balance between desire and doctrine led to creative solutions. Young couples invented codes, knots in belts, flowers behind ears, secret signals with bread crusts. Courtship became a subtle art, especially for those who couldn't afford scandal. They flirted through chores, traded gossip like gold, and stole seconds of contact when no one looked. Even laughter became loaded, who laughed with whom, and for how long. In such a society, romance became both sacred and subversive, and every touch was charged with both tenderness and tension. Virginity was another battlefield, especially for noble women. For them, chastity wasn't just a virtue, it was a clause in a treaty. A girl's purity secured alliances, lands, and dowries. If broken, it could unravel empires. How did they verify it? Poorly. Midwives might inspect, sheets might be displayed, and family pride was hung out like laundry. If blood stained the sheet, it meant celebration. If not, lawsuits. The bedsheet test was not universal, but where practiced, it was treated like divine proof. Guests would gather to await the results like anxious fans of a reality show finale. The cloth would be waved in the air or discreetly inspected behind closed doors. If clean, questions arose. Was she a fraud? Had someone tampered with the linens? Did the groom even try? Was this a scandal or simply poor timing? In some cases, annulments followed. In others, silence prevailed. One thing was certain. Marriage wasn't private. It was a public investment. Male virginity, rarely mentioned. While women were examined, doubted, and documented, men were simply expected to be discreet. A groom with experience was shrugged off. A bride with any history was scandalized. Double standards were as medieval as mead and mud. Some boys were even encouraged to practice before marriage, just not too openly. But no one checked their sheets. Society assumed men knew what they were doing, and if they didn't, well, they'd learn quickly. Same-sex relationships existed too, quietly, dangerously, but undeniably. The church condemned it, calling it unnatural. But hearts don't read doctrine. There are letters between monks that read more like love poems than pious notes. Women in convents pledged lifelong devotion in terms that would make any troubadour blush. These were relationships built in secrecy, coded in metaphor, and whispered through walls. Yet the affection was real, persistent, and often deeply poetic. Let's step away from the scandal and lean into something softer: courtship. Medieval romance wasn't all brothels and sermons, it had gentler corners too. Courtship could be playful, poetic, even tender, when it wasn't supervised like a royal treasury. Villagers might flirt with riddles, jokes, or gifts: an apple, a ribbon, a good fat fish. Nobles preferred songs, falcon feathers, and poetry written by someone else. A love letter might travel through 5 servants and a kitchen maid to reach its target, but however it arrived, it always carried risk and hope. 2. Consent, despite modern assumptions, did exist. Marriage required mutual agreement, at least in the church's eyes. If a woman said "I do" freely, it was binding, even without witnesses. Parents often pressured yes, but a forced yes could sometimes be challenged. In court, a woman could argue she was coerced, drunk, or tricked, and occasionally she won. It wasn't common, but it was real. Medieval women could say no, and when they said yes, it mattered. Hand fasting was one such form of agreement, a spoken vow without priest or altar. 2 people promised themselves to each other, often in private, sometimes in fields. It was legally murky, but emotionally potent. Some considered it trial marriage, others treated it as binding forever. Hand-fasted couples often lived together before formal ceremonies, and when problems arose, local courts debated whether it counted. The line between sin and sacrament was, once again, very thin. Engagements also had weight. Breaking one could lead to lawsuits, especially if gifts had exchanged hands. Did he keep the ring? Did she keep the cow? These were real questions. In some towns, a man who seduced a woman after promising marriage had to wed her or face public punishment. This law was abused by both sides, but it reflected an effort at accountability. People took promises seriously, even if those promises were whispered in a stable. Love had consequences, and not always romantic ones. For women, especially peasants, marriage was both a hope and a trap. It offered protection, stability, and status, but it also handed control to the husband. After marriage, a woman's legal identity was often absorbed into her spouse's. She couldn't sue, inherit, or travel without his consent. Still, some found power in influence, managing farms, finances, and families with quiet authority. A sharp wife could out-negotiate her husband in the market and the bedroom, even if she technically needed his permission to sneeze in court. For noble women, the stakes were higher. Marriage was strategy. It sealed alliances, calmed wars, and claimed castles. Daughters were moved like chess pieces, engaged at 8, married at 12, widowed by 16. But some wielded real influence through clever marriages and bold decisions. A wealthy widow could own land, raise armies, and run vast estates. In many cases, her freedom began when her husband died, and some didn't mourn quite as loudly as expected. Love still bloomed amid the rules. A knight might carry a lady's scarf into battle, then compose awful poetry about it later. Troubadours sang of distant, unattainable women, preferably married to someone terrifying. Courtly love emphasized suffering, devotion, and longing without fulfillment. It was romantic, yes, but also incredibly dramatic. Think of it as the medieval version of a slow-burn love triangle that never ends. It entertained courts and sometimes ruined them. Not all love was poetic. Much of it was practical. 2 people met at the market, saw each other at mass, and decided life might be easier together. Shared chores, shared space, shared silence. Romance came in the form of a second blanket or extra eggs. A husband who remembered your name during Lent was considered thoughtful, a wife who didn't burn the bread twice in a week, a treasure. These were not grand gestures, but wedding celebrations ranged from lavish to muddy. Nobles hosted feasts with roasted swans and jongleurs. Peasants had bread, ale, dancing, and hopefully no livestock injuries. Music played, rings exchanged, and wine flowed until someone fell into the fire pit. Sometimes the bride was carried to bed by guests, cheering all the way. Sometimes she was led quietly while relatives pretended not to listen. But always, the community was watching. Marital consummation was considered proof of legitimacy. If the marriage wasn't completed, it could be annulled. This led to awkward legal cases involving bedroom witnesses or suspicious sheets. One court demanded both spouses testify under oath about their performance. Another asked for midwives to confirm signs of use. If love began awkwardly, medieval law made sure it didn't stay private for long. Marriages didn't just unite hearts, they signed contracts in sweat. Some marriages were passionate, others were peaceful, and some were disasters. Abuse existed, though rarely punished. Divorce was nearly impossible unless granted by the Pope or severe cause. Women could separate from husbands, but only with extreme justification. Even then, she might lose her home, children, and income. But medieval women weren't powerless. They used wit, community, and even the law when needed. One record describes a wife who staged ghost sightings until her husband left. Another convinced the town priest that her husband's snoring was demonic possession. Sometimes they escaped by entering convents, safe havens with structure and books. Other times, they simply endured, but they never stopped thinking. Parenthood quickly followed marriage. Children were blessings, but risky ones. Childbirth was dangerous, with many women dying young. Fathers prayed, mothers screamed, midwives boiled herbs and crossed fingers. Despite everything, families grew, chaotic, loud, and usually hungry. Love expanded not through poetry, but through shared blankets and boiled cabbage. Even if affection was rarely spoken, it was often felt. Affection wasn't always physical. It lived in routine, in care, in stubborn survival, in peasants trading food when illness struck, in nobles protecting their children's inheritance, in lovers staying silent so the other wouldn't be punished, in holding hands behind market stalls, even if briefly. Love didn't always look like a fairy tale, but it lived. And sometimes, against all odds, joy bloomed. A husband danced with his wife during planting season. Even amid filth, fear, and fire, connection persisted, because where there are people, there is always love. In the rarest moments, passion found expression even without approval or permission. A stolen glance at twilight, a shared loaf of bread left at a doorstep. One noblewoman embroidered her lover's name into the hem of a surcoat. Another carved initials into a chapel pew, disguised among prayers. Even when lips could not speak, hands found ways to remember. These were not grand romances for songs. They were quiet rebellions. Affection whispered where proclamations would have been punished. Stories of love trickled through villages like myths passed between sheep pens. A widow who never remarried because no man ever sang like he did. A baker who shaped loaves into hearts every midsummer for 20 years. A peasant who walked 20 miles with a single apple just to propose. These stories lived longer than lords and battles, carried by grandmothers and firelight. They weren't written in books, but they etched themselves into kitchens and cradle songs. In that way, love outlasted kingdoms, and while love endured, intimacy evolved with age. Older couples, though rarely depicted in medieval art, were very real and very affectionate. They shared routines, finished each other's prayers, and warmed each other's feet. No one sang songs about them, but their laughter filled the silence between bells. They might no longer steal kisses behind haystacks, but they stole naps together in the shade. After decades of toil, they understood that tenderness often came without urgency. And that too was love, the kind that needed no approval. In convents and monasteries, intimacy took other forms. Friendships became lifelines, emotional intimacy wrapped in sacred language. Some nuns exchanged devotional writings so passionate, modern scholars blush. Brothers in faith wrote each other letters that echoed with longing and spiritual desire. These weren't always romantic, but they weren't cold either. The human heart, even cloistered, finds ways to connect. Behind stone walls, love sometimes wore the robe of God. Art captured these complexities imperfectly. Illuminated manuscripts often showed lovers as saints or sinners, rarely just people. There were images of Adam and Eve, cautionary tales of lustful kings, and saints resisting temptation. But between the margins, tiny doodles told other stories. Snails chasing knights, rabbits kissing, men mooning angels, absurdity that mocked morality. These marginalia were graffiti with gold leaf, playful reminders that life couldn't be tamed by rules. And perhaps, in those strange little images, the truest intimacy peeked through. The laws tried to control desire. The church tried to shame it. But the body had its own liturgy, one written in heat, longing, and laughter. A kiss in the stable defied as many commandments as any sermon could quote. A touch shared in fear was holier than a dry blessing. People sinned, yes, but they also loved. And between the lines of law, they lived. Even those who couldn't read knew the language of affection. A blanket shared in winter, a bowl saved for someone not yet home, a glance during evening prayers that lingered just a moment too long. These were the love letters of the illiterate, unwritten but deeply understood, and far harder to burn than parchment, because they lived in memory, not margins. Jealousy had its own page in this medieval theatre. Husbands suspicious of peddlers, wives watching the spinning maid too closely. Accusations flew without proof, sometimes weaponized in feuds. One woman was accused of adultery simply because she sang too cheerfully. Another man was flogged for sharing glances during a feast. Yet beneath these dramas, the root was often fear, of loss, of shame, of being unloved. Even suspicion, in its twisted way, proved that love had weight. Punishments for perceived misbehavior varied from absurd to cruel. A man might be ordered to confess with a cabbage on his head. A woman might be forced to carry her husband's boots for a week in silence. More severe cases brought public lashings, exile, or forced marriage. But often, these punishments were more theatre than deterrent. Villagers watched, gossiped, clapped, or wept, and the cycle of scandal and forgiveness turned once more. But love, in truth, needed no permission. It bloomed in the cracks of control, fed by laughter and small mercies. A soldier returning from war to find his wife older, wiser, and still waiting. A girl who married the stable boy, despite her father's plans. A nun who refused to denounce her friend, even under threat of expulsion. These acts, small as they seemed, reshaped the idea of what love could be. Not grand, but good. Not everyone found love, of course. Many marriages were cold, arranged, or simply endured. Loneliness walked through castles and cottages alike, yet even the loveless craved warmth, a hand to hold, a song remembered. Sometimes, widows sat with widowers just to share silence. Sometimes, broken hearts lit candles for those who never returned. Even pain spoke the language of intimacy. And so, medieval intimacy was not a tale of purity or depravity. It was a dance, clumsy, coded, courageous. It slipped through barred windows and under church doors. It hummed in lullabies, echoed in barns, and wept beside deathbeds. Love lived in gesture more than doctrine, and the heart, stubborn and reckless, kept beating in spite of everything, even when history tried to silence it. The Middle Ages weren't loveless. They were full of love too complex to fit tidy scripts. Love was hidden, shouted, punished, praised, betrayed, and endured. It was both sin and salvation, burden and balm. Medieval lovers were not saints, but they weren't fools either. They wanted what we all want, to be seen, touched, remembered. And even if their names are lost, their longing remains, etched in time, in whispers, and in wood. We tend to imagine them as dirty or devout, brutish or brainless, but they were us, awkward, yearning, afraid, amused, trying to survive in a world they didn't fully understand, guided by fear, desire, faith, and instinct. They stitched their feelings into fabric, pressed them into loaves, carved them into beams. Even without the words, they wrote poems with their lives. Some were sad, some were strange, but all of them were human. So the next time you hear someone laugh about how weird medieval intimacy was, remember it wasn't just about rules, relics, or ridiculous belts. It was about hands held in fear, promises whispered in the dark, about love that bloomed in silence and survived in spite of everything. In straw beds and stone halls, in songs and shame, it endured. Because where there are people, there is always longing, and where there is longing, there is always love.
The Middle Ages ended, but the myths they built around love still linger. We imagine cold castles, arranged marriages, and lifetimes of silence. But under the dust of doctrine and stone, real hearts beat. People longed, touched, regretted, wept, just as we do now. Their love didn't look like ours, but it lived where it mattered, in warm breath on cold mornings, in forgiveness offered quietly, in choices made without witnesses. What remains of their love is fragile, a faded letter in a monastery wall, a carved name on a chapel bench hidden by moss, a recipe passed from mother to daughter, meant for wedding feasts, a lullaby that once soothed a child into sleep beside a dying fire. These aren't grand monuments, but they're monuments nonetheless, etched in flesh, in grain, in gesture. We've inherited more than just architecture and laws. We've inherited the echoes of their affections, the stories they couldn't tell publicly, but lived privately, the little rituals of love they whispered into one another's palms, the trust passed like folded cloth between wives and midwives, the poems scratched behind altars, unsigned but unmistakable. These fragments teach us love resists erasure. Medieval medicine even recorded intimacy's effects, sometimes hilariously, sometimes seriously. Physicians advised when not to lie together, during illness, after cheese, during storms. Some recommended avoiding intercourse in the south wind. Others warned that too much love could drain a man's vital essence. Meanwhile, women were cautioned to avoid passion, lest their womb wander. And yet, despite the fear and confusion, healing and closeness often went hand in hand. Midwives knew touch could soothe faster than prayer. Ancient manuscripts list love potions made from wine, honey, saffron, and sometimes beaver testicles. Some were real, some were fraud. Most were desperate hope in a bottle. Charms were sewn into hems, herbs burned in corners, spells whispered in secret. One widow carried a charm to help her forget her husband's cruelty and find peace. Another buried a rosemary wreath under her bed, praying for a gentle dream. Love wasn't just wanted, it was worked for. And in that work, there was reverence. Monasteries catalogued sins in detail, but they also preserved love in art. Painted saints stood beside grieving widows and yearning pilgrims. Christ was often drawn with open hands, open arms, a symbol of divine intimacy. Artists couldn't depict romance openly, but they hid it in gestures. A man's hand brushing another's, a woman weeping for someone unnamed. These were sacred stories told in silence, because not all intimacy needed words. In some corners of Europe, folk beliefs offered alternatives to shame. Pagan festivals celebrated fertility, warmth, touch. Midsummer bonfires weren't just rituals, they were opportunities. Dances turned into embraces, drink turned into permission. And though the church frowned,
It rarely stopped the fires, because even priests knew people would be people, even in cassocks and confessionals. We often flatten the past into caricature. We think of the Middle Ages as all plague, dirt, and prayer, but it was also soft light through stained glass, bread still warm from the oven, shared in silence, a lover's breath against your shoulder after hours of hard labor. It was laughter in between wars and mercy in between rules, and it was affection, messy and miraculous. Not every story was happy, many weren't. Abuse existed, so did abandonment, cruelty, betrayal, but love still endured, in its fractured, flawed, forgiving forms. A peasant woman raised 7 children alone after her husband vanished in war. A nun sang the same lullaby to each orphan she took in. A man wept beside his wife's grave, carving a heart into her headstone. These were acts of love too. When we read their words, those that survived, we hear longing clearly. A knight writes to his lady, "I cannot sleep, for your absence drowns me." A young woman scrawls, "I would rather die honest with you than live untouched." A friar, excommunicated for forbidden affection, still ends his letter with love, as always. They wrote not because it was safe, but because they couldn't not. That is the true nature of love. It insists, even when silenced. We think of love as modern, but it is not. It's as old as hunger, as stubborn as dust. It's baked into every language, every lullaby, every prayer. In a world ruled by kings, popes, and plague, people still chose each other, not always well, not always safely, but with startling humanity. They stitched love into life, thread by imperfect thread. They dared to hold each other in spite of warnings. They fell in love over and over, with nothing but faith and timing. They dreamed of connection, even if it came in stolen moments. And we, centuries later, still do the same.